Greetings fellow Mist Wanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mists, covering all things Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. I'm making this video based on a number of posts I've seen on the Curse of Strahd subreddit. There's a good DMs Facebook group where people ask the question, can I do Curse of Strahd with characters starting at level 5? And that could be because they've done another adventure first of all, such as Lost Mine of Phandelver, which a lot of people do because it's in the starter set, so they might do Lost Mine of Phandelver first. It's what I did, and it's one of the reasons I'm making this video. Lost Mine of Phandelver has now been sort of readapted into what's called Phandelver and Below the Shattered Obelisk. But there's other adventures as well that sometimes take people to level 5, such as Waterdeep Dragon Heist, which I've been a player in, and it's fantastic. And Dragon of Ice Spire Peak, which is another sort of introductory adventure. I think it might actually take people to level 6. I'm primarily going to be talking about starting Curse of Strahd at level 5, sort of the pros and cons of doing so, what to watch out for, what to potentially change. So Curse of Strahd is meant to start at, well, technically level 1 if you're doing Death House, but sort of beyond Death House and after you leave Death House, or another introductory adventure if you don't do Death House, Curse of Strahd is meant to start at level 3. So by starting at level 5, that's a jump of 2 more levels, which doesn't sound like a lot. But at level 5, characters tend to get a lot more boons. So they can do extra attack if they are a martial class. If they are a spellcaster, then they have their cantrips are more powerful. I think they go up and they're an extra die damage. So it can make the game a little bit easier potentially. And they might also have some magic items as well. There's quite a few in Lost Mine of Phandelver. Oh, by the way, there will be spoilers for Lost Mine of Phandelver / Phandelver Below Shattered Obelisk. Goes without saying because I'll be talking about transitioning from one to the other. So yeah, they could have magic items from that instead of going into Barovia with no magic items at all. The good news is you shouldn't have to change too much. My experience, I ran Lost Mine of Phandelver, and then when they finished at level 5, the Mists dragged them into Barovia, so they started Curse of Strahd level 5. I had 5 players, most of them fairly new and inexperienced, but not necessarily. And they had, even though starting at level 5, they still had a hard time of it. We had 2 very serious near TPKs. One was at Yester Hill, and the other was at the coffin shop in Vallaki. I think that's responsible for a lot of TPKs or near TPKs in a lot of Curse of Strahd campaigns. Even though they started at level 5, even though they have magic items, they still, while maybe some aspects of Barovia were a little easier than they could have and should have been, they still had a hard time of it. All I really changed was probably the biggest change I made was making the random encounters along the Svarlich Road as they travel Barovia from point to point. I made some of those harder. So in the book, some of them can be really challenging even at level 3 and level 4. But from like level 5 onwards, they're a little bit easier to the point where, you know, they can even get a little bit trivial. I think this is kind of done on purpose because it's supposed to be tough when they first arrive, and then when they're nearly ready to face Strahd, if the random encounters are easier, then it suggests to them, right, we're ready, we can do this. But what I didn't want to do is have them be too easy for my players starting at level 5 with the magic items. So all I did was added more monsters, gave them more HP. I also did some mixed units. So when they escorted Irina to Vallaki, instead of just having wolves or just having direwolves, I had a mix. I had wolves and direwolves. I almost like added 2 random encounters together, upped the numbers, made sure they had higher HP. And yeah, it wasn't hard, but it wasn't easy either. It was a decent challenge. You know, that kind of encounter is kind of good for Strahd to be spying and see who are these new adventurers in my domain and what are they made of. But also, I've heard, I can't remember where I read this, but there was a great suggestion where sometimes when you do mixed units, depending on what they can do really cool things. So having wolves and ghouls, instead of having one or the other, if you have both, you have wolves can knock player characters prone, and then that means that the ghouls get advantage with their attack where they could potentially paralyze a player, and then it's feeding time. Grim. I'm probably going to do a video soon of random encounters if you want to spice up and change what's in the table in the book and want to introduce some stuff that isn't necessarily just monster manual stuff or stuff in the Curse of Strahd appendix, stuff from perhaps Mordenkainen Presents Monsters of the Multiverse, which kind of combines and changes things in Bowler's Guide to Monsters, Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. There's some great Barovia friendly monsters in there, great Shadowfell type monsters. then I'll probably do a video about that soon. There's some great resources on DM's Guild. There's one in particular I recommend. So I'll make sure I prioritize that as a video coming soon. So that was one thing I did. I made the random encounters harder. The other thing I did was I simply held off on leveling them up to level 6. So what helped is they didn't do much combat. They arrived into Barovia at level 5. We skipped Death House. That's another thing. Skip Death House, because that's obviously up to level 3. They skipped Death House. They went to the village of Barovia. They escorted Irina to... Firstly, they were obviously to Vallaki, but they went via Sir Pool encampment to get the card reading from Madame Eva. They had a couple of encounters. One was the skeletal horse going past. I did that on the bridge over Sir Falls, and they didn't actually attack it. They just let it right past them. Then they had some wolves at the west gate of Barovia. That was the dire wolves I mentioned earlier. They got to Vallaki. There wasn't any encounters there. And then when they were given the winery quest, they had one random encounter before going to the winery. And then it wasn't until they did the winery and Yester Hill that I let them level up to level 6. And that sounds like I'm holding it off a long time. And I have had one player at the time who was always like eager to level up, and like, you know, he was a bit cheeky and would often say like, I think he thought because I was a newish DM that I was like forgetting to level them up, or not leveling them up properly, or not leveling them up regularly. And even he didn't seem to mind the how long it took from level 5 to level 6. And I think it was because obviously they didn't do a lot of combat. And then at that point they were level 6. And to be honest, at that point they probably would have been level 6 anyway if they had started at level 3 and done the trip to Vallaki and a few things afterwards. So it's kind of, that was just another thing to do. Ultimately, a lot of this depends on factors that are specific to you and your game and your table. For example, how many PCs you have. If you have lots of PCs starting at level 5, they are going to have an easier time. If you only have 2 or 3 PCs starting at level 5, that's probably going to be the equivalent of a larger party starting at level 3 or 4. So it's not too bad on the balancing front. It depends on the experience of the players. So, like I said earlier, most of my players were fairly new. If you've got very experienced players, if you have combat savvy players as well, then that's going to make things easier for them. It can depend on what classes you have amongst your PCs. So when I played Curse of Strahd before DMing it, our group didn't have a paladin or a cleric, and they can make a big difference because they can do a fair bit of radiant damage. And obviously when you're dealing with vampire spawns, radiant, and vampires as a whole, such as Strahd, radiant damage is a big thing. And then also my group, when I DM'd it, didn't have a paladin or a cleric. At least they didn't have a paladin straight away. One joined towards the end of the campaign. So if you don't have any of those, then starting at level 5 will still be a challenge. If you're starting at level 5 and you have a paladin or a cleric or both or multiple, then they probably are going to have an easier time of it. Another thing as well is magic items. So if you've played another campaign before Curse of Strahd, it stands to reason that they're entering Curse of Strahd probably with some magic items already. Minor-ish spoiler for Lost Mine of Phandelver / Shattered Obelisk is that there is a weapon called Lightbringer that does extra radiant damage to the undead. So that is actually a great weapon to have in Barovia. And hilariously, one of my player who had that, who picked it up from Lost Mine of Phandelver, forgot until halfway through the campaign. He was like, oh, I forgot I had this weapon. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Which obviously helped me out with the whole balancing thing. But yeah, so if they get that item, then it's going to be a lot easier for them. If they get lots of magic items, whether they pick up everything they find in Lost Mine of Phandelver, or you're a generous DM who gives extra magic items, then yeah, you know, because when you're fighting things like werewolves and vampire spawn, werewolves are immune to all damage from non-magical weapons. Off the top of my head, I think, or memory serves, vampire spawn are resistant. Then yeah, you know, if they don't have those weapons, it's going to be harder, and if they do have those weapons, it's going to be easier. One thing I would like to say is obviously the adventure is designed in a particular way. It's designed to be started at level 3 and progress from there. So let's not forget about that. One thing I will point out though, and I have got the book down here, and what I'll probably do so it's easy to show on YouTube, is do a little like box that appears here of a screenshot from of what it looks like. But this table, areas by level, if you look at it, Village of Barovia is 1st to 3rd level anyway. Vallaki and Old Bone Grinder are 4th level, and everything else from there is 5th level anyway. So if you're starting from 5th level, then other than the arriving in the village of Brogue, which doesn't have a huge amount of combat unless you're tweaking things, entering Valachian the first time, and the Allbone Grinder, the windmill, which some parties skip as well, so some people don't fight them straight away and fight them at a higher level anyway. If you skip those, or once you're past those, I should say, you're going to be 5th level anyway. So it's not a huge jump. It's more of a problem, I guess, if you're starting the campaign at 6th level, which is at the end of Dragon of Icefire Peak. You know, if you've done, say, a homebrew campaign, I see some posts sometimes where people say, oh, my players are starting Curse of Strahd at level 7 or level 8 or level 9. That is a big issue, because those are the kinds of levels where they should be facing Strahd, and they're already arriving to Barovia at that point and at that sort of power level. So what are your options instead if you don't want to start them at level 5? Well, the obvious one is you don't. You get them to change new characters. You've done Lost Mine of Phandelver, they're heroes, they've saved Phandalin, spoilers for Lost Mine of Phandelver again, and potentially those characters could be retired, and Curse of Strahd is run as a completely fresh new campaign, new PCs, starting at level 1, do Death House, get out, or another like starter adventure, get out, arrive and do the rest of Barovia from level 3. That's, you know, and that's the way the campaign's intended, right? So that would be easier, less hassle for you as a DM to just run it that way than worry about having to like potentially balance and tweak stuff, like I've mentioned throughout this video. Another idea, if you really are wanting to do it as a sequel to Lost Mine of Phandelver and similar campaigns, and you're watching this and considering this before finishing those campaigns, you could potentially keep them at this lower level, so they'll be 1 level lower. So what I mean here, for example, is Lost Mine of Phandelver is supposed to be that you finish at 5th level. So you do, again, spoilers, Wave Echo Cave, the final dungeon, and probably at level 4, and they finish it, they finish it, and they're then at level 5. Congratulations, you finished Lost Mine of Phandelver at level 5, and then they enter Barovia. What you could do, and this will ultimately depend, which I'll get to in a minute, is when they finish Wave Echo Cave, keep them at level 4, and then they reach level 5 at a later point, maybe when they reach Vallaki. The reason I say this depends is because ultimately it depends on how long the previous level up was, especially if you're doing something like milestone leveling. If they do, using Lost Mine as an example again, if they do all of Wave Echo Cave at level 4, you might argue, well, they deserve a level up. But if they've done other stuff at level 4 and Wave Echo Cave, they're probably going to think, oh, we must be due a level up at some point. But if they've only just like leveled up to level 4, then that should be fine. You know, don't feel like you've got to give them level 5 just because they've completed the campaign. Hold them off a little bit. That would then mean that they enter Barovia at level 4 instead of level 5, which is closer to level 3, and is probably like a nice in between. What I wouldn't recommend is the following: leveling them down, which, I mean, I would never want to do this as a DM, and I'd hate this as a player. I think most players would hate this. So this would be like saying, oh no, some curse or abilities affected you and you're not at level 5 anymore, you're level 3 with the same characters, is a little bit, you know, it's messy from a character sheet point of view. It's taking stuff away from the players. Nobody likes that. And speaking of taking things away, I wouldn't say take away their items or do other nerfs. So for example, what some people do is when the Vistani escort the party to Barovia, they wake up the next morning, they find, oh no, all of our stuff's been stolen. That as well is, again, it falls under the category of not being, it's just not a good thing for the players to experience. They've just gotten these cool new items like the Lightbringer, the one I mentioned earlier, and then they wake up and they're gone. Even if potentially you could say, oh, they get them back later. I don't know. I wouldn't like it as a player. I'm sure other players wouldn't like it. So proceed with caution. If you do that, that's not the be all and end all. I have seen some anecdotes from some DMs who say they did take items away from players and players liked it. They saw it as a challenge. They saw it as a cool, oh, this is different. Hey, and oh no, this is going to make our lives harder. That's not to say that every player will hate it or any DM who does it is bad. At the end of the day, and a lot of this comes down to, you know your players well. What would they like? What wouldn't they like? And so bear that in mind if you're doing that. And that's it from me. This is kind of a short one, which is nice because my videos tend to be 20 minutes or more. I think this one's going to be like 10 or 15 minutes. Hooray. If you like what you've watched, consider subscribing. I tend to intersperse content. One video will be Curse of Strahd, One video will be Ravenloft, so that's kind of like intended for if you're doing a Ravenloft campaign separate to Curse of Strahd, or what I'm doing myself for my players in my own game is as a sequel to Curse of Strahd. And I think the next video, all going well, will be how I ran Folkovnia, which is another domain like Barovia that's played with monthly zombie sieges. So that's going to be a fun one to record, I think. Thank you, Mist Wanderers.